I am delighted to pivot to welcoming my dear friend, Angel Acosta, who is also a Mobius Senior Expert, whose work embodies so much of what we hold dear in this community: healing, transformation, and leadership rooted in humanity. For the past decade, Angel has worked to bridge the fields of leadership, social justice, and mindfulness. He holds a doctorate in curriculum and teaching from Teachers College, Columbia University, where his pioneering research on healing-centered education laid the foundation for what has become an international practice. He is chair of the Acosta Institute, a consulting and education firm devoted to helping people and organizations heal, transform, and thrive in these turbulent times. After completing his doctoral work, Angel began developing learning experiences that weave leadership development with conversations about inequality and healing, supporting educational leaders through contemplative and restorative practices. In recent years, Angel has turned his attention to the ways technology might become a force for advancing racial equity and dismantling structural inequality. Angel has delivered more than 500 talks raised worldwide and raised over $2 million to support healing-centered initiatives. At the end of the week, we'll let you know how you can donate to support Angel's work. He also leads the Garrison Institute Fellowship Program, where I've had the privilege to teach with him, and the Acosta Institute Fellowship Program, cultivating lifelong learners and leaders at the intersection of business, education, and technology. Please join me in warmly welcoming my dear friend, Angel Acosta.
Good morning. Good morning.
Good morning.
I wanted to hold a little moment just to honor the transition of our colleague, but also to kind of touch what I think may be the most important skill of our time, which is presence. Like holding what and who you are in the present moment, irregardless of condition and circumstance, irregardless of the pressures of all of you waiting for me to say something fascinating or important, but just really touching what it means to be here. I'm excited today to share a few things, and I've been kind of listening to all the talks that you've been all kind of taking in since Monday, so I feel like I've been kind of in inquiry with you all, and I've also been kind of sensing into who's here and why you're here, and I just want to say thank you for all the work you do, and it's really, really powerful. And if I had any answer to you around this theme of the future of healing-centered work, the answer is you. The answer is you. So I'm done. And also I wanted to kind of challenge myself a little bit. So I don't have any slides. I don't have any cool slides. And although I took some notes around what I thought would be important to share, I'm actually speaking from a different place. If you want to honor what David Rock said on Monday around unconscious processing, right? Like he was talking about how like our unconscious mind and that powerful force that processes so much more information than a rational mind does. So I wanted to see the quality of my presence combined with my expertise maybe. What would that share? What would that allow to emerge? May I proceed in that way? Okay. Let me tell you just a couple stories, and then allow me to weave some principles that cut across what we call the healing-centered paradigm in business, education and technology. When I was about 10, 15 years ago, I was working for a nonprofit, traveling all over the country, helping low-income students from around the country, from Native American institutions and reservations in North Dakota to Appalachia and the Bible Belt to the Bronx. And I was in that position just supporting students going into the belly of the beast of public education in the United States, working with students, teachers, counselors, parents. And I feel like I had a good kind of grasp on how amazing the public school system is in this country. It's a true gift. And its limitations. Its limitations. I could see the trauma that many students were experiencing from the economic conditions in their neighborhoods and how that trauma would come from the neighborhood into the classroom. And you'd have teachers who are trying to teach and they're engaging in classroom management. They're trying to teach instruction. And I was just fascinated by the exhaustion that teachers were experiencing. I was fascinated by the frenetic energy that many principals and superintendents would be living in. And I would be like, are they okay? Are they okay? And so I kind of left that last year working for the organization feeling both a profound appreciation for our public school system, but a deep concern around the burnout and the ways in which our system puts a lot of pressure on our schools and our students and our school staff. So through some mentorship, I was guided into pursuing a doctorate. And many of you who know, a doctorate is not fun. It sounds sexy, but it's not fun. It's not fun. It's not fun. I mean, when you're done, you can just say, I'm a doc, but when you're in it, it's a true marathon, and it's kind of both intellectual stimulation and intellectual torture, just to be frank. So I'm in my first year of my doctorate, consulting, I'm working full time, and I'm taking 5 courses, I'm reading 3 books a week, I'm writing 2 papers a week, and I am exhausted. And so I had to make it worthwhile. So I said, if I'm gonna do this, I have to ask the most powerful question that I can ask. That honors both what I've seen in the system and honors where I think we might be able to go as a society. And I found this really interesting dynamic happening. One, in terms of social justice, that term kind of is fading in the public discourse now, but it is still there, and it's still real. So I saw that the powerful work that social justice movements, social justice pedagogy had done to create this powerful focus on the systems that cause suffering, from racism to classism, gender inequality, you name it. We were able to develop a pedagogical approach that taught people, both activists and students, how to name these systems, these structures, in a really profound way, to change them. And at the same time, I was looking at the mindfulness world and the mindfulness community. And as many of you know, at least in the United States and in the West, mindfulness was very popular over the last 10 years. You had mindful everything. You had mindful eating, mindful walking, mindfulness in the Navy, just everywhere. In fact, there was a strong critique that came up, a book called Mac Mindfulness, right? That, in the American context, we become so obsessed with mindfulness that we can franchise it. So I'm here at the doctor just trying to ask a question that would be profound, and I'm looking at these two communities, and I'm like, ooh, I see a pattern. In the social justice realm, you have people trying to change these systems, address them, teach others how to identify them, and but they were burning out trying to do that, both in terms of activism and teaching. And in the mindfulness world, I see folks zenning out, doing all kinds of yoga poses, trying to escape the very systems that these folks over here were trying to change. And I found that fascinating. I it was like Moses, the sea just cleared for me. And that was the question that I began my doctoral dissertation with. What is the connection or missed connection between social justice education and mindfulness-based education? And it was such a rich inquiry. It just kind of really allowed me to look at so many aspects of this work. And that first year, as I started to go deeper, I began to notice some patterns around both communities. And part of the connection, one of the connections between both of these communities was this profound attempt to deal with trauma. Whether it was through a direct addressing of changing these systems or a kind of subtle escape. So that kind of opened up my thinking around, okay, so then I started looking at trauma and the trauma studies field and just beautiful work around our understanding of what happens when we experience adverse childhood experiences or difficult moments in our lives. And there, a whole world opened for me, thinking about healing as well. And I remember when this came to me, I was like, ooh, this feels juicy. And I asked, well, is healing-centered education possible? When that entered, that download came through, I was like, ooh, that feels nice. Trauma's a little rough, right? It's like, you can only talk about trauma so much before it becomes traumatic for you to even mention the term. So I was like, ooh, healing-centered education, that sounds nice, that sounds juicy. And then I asked the question, what are healing-centered pedagogies? When we look at the constellation of human practices, like what comes to mind, right? So that the initial question around mindfulness and social justice evolved to healing-centered pedagogies. And when I started to ask that question, the first evidence that I began to see around what were healing-centered practices came from Indigenous communities. And, oh my God, you should have seen. I mean, think about it. Especially in North America, you have other examples in Maori and in a couple regions around the world, but in particular in North America, you have to think about what it must have taken to confront, withhold, and witness the taking of your land, the attempt to robbing you of your language, the taking of your children and placing them in boarding schools, and the cultural, emotional, and psychological torture that came with colonization and imperialism. And there, you see what I argued was not the beginnings, but some of the most powerful examples of healing-centered practice. How do you stand erect in the face of such challenge? So I fell down the rabbit hole studying indigeneity, indigenous practice, and different principles from a variety of different traditions, from the Hopi to the Lakota. I'm just thinking about prophecy right now. There's a lot of many of you have heard of some of the prophecies that are there in those traditions, the Hopi and the Lakota Sioux. They've spoken about this time. Whether they call it the fifth fire, the fifth crossing, like they spoke about a time where there would be this dense period of transformation. And from that work, I learned so much about relationality. Like, how do you attend to relationships with the people that you're working with? That opened up a whole world around indigenous research methodologies. You see, you got to think about, as much as I love anthropology, I studied anthropology myself, but those were tools for colonial rule. Even accounting. Accounting refined its practices post-slavery and during slavery. You got to count well. So some of these tools in higher education were oftentimes used, at the tip of some of the most marginalized folks. So to see indigenous people do like a social aikido on these disciplines was fascinating. And I'll just share one piece around indigenous approaches to research that might be useful for you. Imagine if you approach research not as this cold, extractive approach where as a scientist or social scientist you're trying to, keep a certain distance so that you can observe as objectively as possible. What if you oriented towards that as a ceremony? Like research as ceremony. When I first read that book by Sean Wilson, Research as Ceremony, it just took my breath away. You would have laughed when I was in front of my doctoral dissertation committee the day of presenting my doctoral research to be, ordained a doctor. And I say to them, the opening thing I say is, for you, this is a doctoral defense. For me, this is a ceremony. See, I didn't care. Beyond that point, I didn't care with their notes, trying to observe which research paradigm I missed or which methodological approach I may have misquoted. I didn't care about that because I was activating a whole nother dimension, right? So for you as coaches, as business folk, what does it mean to carry your business as ceremony? As ceremony. So I get what I need and continue to honor indigenous communities and insight. We have a lot of elders in our network that teach us a lot about relationality and being in relation. It's so deep. And then I keep going. Okay, so what's next? What are other healing-centered pedagogies? What are other approaches to education that might engender any kind of healing? And of course, mindfulness comes up, mindfulness. And I love contemplative practices, and I dive into the full, at least what I could, in terms of that field. And wow, what a beautiful contribution from our religious traditions, especially the Buddhist tradition, that the name comes out of the Buddha's Eightfold Path, mindfulness. And of course, Buddhism doesn't have complete dominion over mindfulness. You have Christian contemplative prayer, Jesuit and Jewish contemplation. But at the core, you really want to be grateful for those traditions. And there was a powerful movement of folks, especially some of the Asian communities that moved to the United States during the building of the Transatlantic Railroad. We tend to forget them. When we think about American mindfulness, and these are my elders, so I'm not talking bad about them. But the white folks that left the United States in the 1960s to go east and came back and made American mindfulness popular, thank you. But often, that's the history we tell. And, thank you, Jack Kornfield. Thank you. Dan Goleman is going to be here soon, so you got to give him a shout out. Mirabai Bush, my elder. But there's a forgotten history of the early Asian communities that came during the building of the Panama Canal, during the building of the Transatlantic Railroad, that actually were the seeds of American mindfulness. So I'm in it. I'm like just digging in, trying to learn about this powerful methodology. And at this point, we know that 8 weeks of mindfulness practices is enough to catalyze neuroplasticity. You can rewire your brain in 8 weeks of practice, 8 minutes a day. We know that constant mindfulness practice across 2 months, you're able to reduce impulsivity, increase well-being, reduce rigidity, even deepen almost like a spiritual relationship with the world. There's a phenomenon that happens after enough practice where you feel this kind of oneness. You ever had that? You're like, this is oneness with all, right? And then stress comes back, and then you're like, So thank you. So you have indigenous wisdom traditions, you have mindfulness, and then I looked at the social emotional learning movement, right? Daniel's coming. Daniel Gomes here. He's going to be here. His book, Emotional Intelligence, when that came out in 98, 99, that was huge. Him and Howard Gardner's book, Multiple Intelligence, right? We're not just, this obsession with IQ over the last 100 years was misapplied. We are emotionally intelligent, we're socially intelligent, we're musically intelligent, we're mathematically intelligent. There's all kinds of other intelligence. Why so obsessed with this acute form? So social emotional learning, this idea of being able to process each other's feelings and process our own and develop kind of more collaborative team working skills was a powerful contribution, especially coming out of Harvard. That was huge, right? And it gave birth to the whole pro-social movement. So thank you to social and emotional learning. So indigenous knowledge, mindfulness, social emotional learning, and I kept going. So what else? And of course, I had to spend a little time looking at the history of trauma research and our understanding of trauma studies. So I'm in there and I'm cooking. I'm like, let's go. All right. And it was fascinating to see the growth of the field. If you think about it, and you all know this, think about like post-World War I, people are coming back from war and they're exhibiting these symptoms. And can somebody tell me what was trauma named or called after World War I? When a soldier came back from war and was exhibiting these hyper-impulsive, sometimes, yes? Shell shock. Thank you. $100 for you. No, I was kidding. Shell shock. And that was kind of the beginning of like our trauma literacy, right? And then we move on to post-World War II and even like inching over at the end of the Vietnam War. And what were we calling soldiers who were coming from Vietnam? What did they have? PTSD. Right? So just in like 60 years, our language around trauma began to evolve. All of a sudden, we have post-traumatic stress disorder. And then across the next like 40 years, we know that it ain't only soldiers that experience trauma. Women in particular in abusive relationships. People in poverty. And then you have CPTSD, complex post-traumatic stress. And then honoring the mental health field, thank you for the diagnostic and all these, other diagnoses. But I noticed there was an issue there. This hyper-focus on the individual. So Takut, so you are the one, for example, as an example, with post-traumatic stress, but there was no real account of the environment that was causing or activating the symptoms in the first place. So even in the trauma research, trauma studies movement, there were some beautiful tensions. And there you have PTSE, post-traumatic stress environment. And that kind of opened up a whole inquiry because it was important. This hyperfixation on the individual is just limiting. So beginning to look at what are the systems, what are the structures, what are the ideologies that then lead to traumatic behavior, right? And I'll just share two more pieces around why this strand of the paradigm was so interesting. And many of you know the whole positive psychology movement. It was a huge moment in psychology. You know, for 70 years in psychology, the question was, what's wrong with you? What's the neurosis? What's going on with you? You good? But in the 90s, folks like Martin Seligman and others began to ask, well, what's good with you? It's a simple question. What are the conditions for you to thrive? And you know, as those of us who are American, we love a good self-help book. Thank you, Oprah. Thank you. You know, you got to give a shout out to the self-help movement. You know, no shade. Thank you. No. So in positive psychology, that was a big moment for us to ask, what are the conditions that you need to thrive? And the whole happiness question. Are you happy? Are you happy? How to be happy? I think people made more money asking that question than any other question. How to become happy. I probably have 4 books on how to become happy. But seriously though, the big takeaway in the nexus between positive psychology and trauma studies, as far as the most cutting edge, is post-traumatic growth. Right? That you can experience adverse childhood experiences or difficult moments in your life, but that you can actually grow in a really significant way after. And, you know, because of my orientation of social justice, I'm a slight critic. You know, I get a little spicy. And I get a little mad when I talk about this, only because the post-traumatic growth research I felt was hidden for many of us. For example, they were studying Olympic athletes for years. They were studying Navy SEALs for years. If you just look into peak performance research, they had a lot of these principles, but you had to pay. You had to, you know, so I'm glad now that we can talk about post-traumatic growth and peak performance for all of us, but I get a little edgy there. So can you begin to feel the power of indigenous practice, mindfulness, social emotional learning, and the field of trauma studies, right? And how this contributes to this healing-centered turn, right? There's a couple other more pieces that I'll share, and then I'll entertain some questions. In the trend, this is stuff you already know. I'm just kind of mirroring back to you what you're walking in. It's tied to trauma studies, but the somatic turn, somatic movement. You've heard, somatic experiencing, Dr. Peter Levine. But somewhere along the line, we remembered our bodies. You all know that us in the West, we got this thing with this here. We are here all the time, right? It's a byproduct of, the Cartesian logic of mind-body dualism. Thank you to the philosophers, and no thank you at the same time. This idea that the mind is superior to the body. The idea that empiricism, the taking in of the world through the senses, prioritizing logic, Thank you, it was useful, but now we need to return. We need to come home. And the somatic movement is an example of that. And the somatic movement is actually a dance between, I think, trauma studies and the body. If you look at the title of Peter Levine's book, In an Unspoken Voice, How the Body Releases Trauma. So thank you to somatics and the somatic movement. I'll share two last major pieces of this paradigm. Second is the second to last is restorative justice. You see, somewhere around the 60s, we began to ask, like, hold up, why does especially American culture become obsessed with incarceration? What is this impulse? And across the next 50 years, why do we have 25% of the world's prisoners? Over 2 million people. And why do most of the prisoners look like me? And why are some of the disciplinary codes and policies in our public schools resemble so much of our prison system? And why is there such a connection between kids who get suspended or put in detention with the prison system? The whole school to prison pipeline. And again, why do those children who end up in detention and end up possibly in the prison to school pipeline look like me? So restorative justice. Whoa, juicy paradigm within this work, asking the question like, no, we shouldn't, if something happens between students, we should have the skill sets to facilitate a process where we can keep the children in the school, not exile them from the school, right? So restorative justice in terms of prison reform, and in particular, helping us deal with conflict and discipline in schools. Major. And just as an aside, like even that field has like splinters. Like there's restorative justice, and there's like healing justice, and there's transformational justice. You can hear some really rich debates between them, like, oh no, I call it this because, the big difference is just where you're drawing your critique. Is it mainly focused on the prison system, racial justice? And it's just a beautiful note that actually a major contributor to the restorative justice and the restorative movement were actually Quakers. Like Quakers were able to contribute some incredible insights into how to hold circle and do circle work. So as I'm digging in there, I'm like, oh, this is juicy. So there you have it. You have indigenous knowledge, social and emotional learning, mindfulness, trauma studies, somatic practice, and that at the moment was what I called the healing-centered turn in education. That there was enough evidence to show that there's a healing-centered paradigm afoot. And that kind of closed that chapter of my inquiry, and then I kind of began to evolve it and actually play with it in public. So we built out the Acosta Institute, and since we finished the doctorate, about 6 years, we've been doing research and doing all kinds of programming, testing to see if this constellation of forces could be of use to us. And I'm grateful to say that it has. And I'll end the next few minutes just giving you what I think are some of the most powerful things that you might want to take away with in terms of having played around with these ideas. And then before I do that, do you feel the power of the concentration of these particular approaches? So just hold that. And then what's also part of this wave is the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement just, opened up a whole inquiry in American society in particular. The women's movement. In the 70s and 60s were hot. The women's movement, the Disability Rights Act, the LGBTQIA movement, the environmental movement, and us trying to figure out how we live in equilibrium with Mother Earth. Those are also social movements that are part of the healing, centered, and restorative turn. In fact, the mother of all those movements is the abolitionist movement. You got to think about that question, should we break the back of chattel slavery? The biggest healing-centered move. In fact, you don't have any of those movements. I'm not here if it wasn't for abolition. So, what I want to leave you with in terms of at least understanding this paradigm is, thank you for the research. Thank you for the research paradigms. And there's so much more I can tell you around other different strands of the research, but then also the social movements, right? And that's why, it's hard for me to wake up every day and see what's happening in our society, in our country, and be too mad or dark. Because I'm drawing on this force. What keeps my back arch is so profound that I don't have a minute to waste with apathy. I need to move. And I want to honor what Amy mentioned around, was it Banny? Brittle, anxious, non-linear, incomprehensible. Damn. It reminds me of the military a few years ago. What was it? VUCA, you know, you're my people, you know. And VUCA stands for? Pull that out in your coaching session. Let me tell you about VUCA. But yeah, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. Wow, it's like VUCA graduated to Benny, and I appreciate those acronyms. Thank you. The limitations, though, is that they cut us off from tradition. They cut us off from the momentum of the sacrifices that came before. See, I ain't got time to think about VUCA and Banny when I came from people who literally their humanity was questioned. Oh, there's a brittle and nonlinear and incomprehensible situation. Well, you go underground. You develop spiritual practices that allow you to sustain a relationship to source. You seed social movements that at some point tomorrow would make change. Literally, in the African American tradition, there's a great concept called freedom dreaming. Freedom dreaming. Filled with songs and stories. In fact, and I know that in our country in particular, there's always this sensitivity around talking about slavery. Oh, it's over, let it go. But I'm like, no, we can relax. Just chill. It happened, and we can kind of look at that history and just, I think is a representation. In fact, this is my true opinion, that the fact that slavery happened in this land is an example of how great this land is. In the sense that we were able to overcome that. We would not be the nation we are without having had that conversation, that tension. We would just be something very different. So, in that moment, there were these practices called hush harbors. Enslaved people, at the end of a difficult workday, would run to the woods. And some of them would collect pots and pans. And they would come together and congregate and yell into the pans. Just talk about the first somatic practitioners. So, Banny, Vuka, thank you. But there is so much more that we can draw on from our people who have seen worse. Seen worse. So I want to invite you in this moment, whenever you see the news and you get really concerned and that, we have access to people who have seen, not just seen worse, but have developed practices to survive worse. And our role is to hold the paradox of just the incomprehensible, yet save a little bit of energy to move, to catalyze the energy into positive change. And one last piece that, as my inquiry around healing-centered education evolved. It evolved. I started to ask, well, I'm doing this research, I'm doing these facilitations, I'm working with these clients, the team and I kind of approach each other in a really kind of healing-centered way, but I'm also running a business, so what is healing-centered business? And the team and I started to really think about, what does healing-centered business look like? And I just asked that question. And that opened up a whole beautiful inquiry. It's not anything new. I think corporate social responsibility is an example of healing-centered business. DEI, for example, diversity, equity, and inclusion, that's an example of healing-centered approaches to business. The environmental and climate change is an example of kind of the thinking about healing-centered business. But I'll just say one thing that I think is important within that paradigm, and you're already doing it. And one is, as a CEO, as a coach, carving out intentional time to sit or reflect around the work. Very simple. Oh, wow, that's a common theme. And you're doing it already. But there's one really rich point here. And this is that healing as strategy. Healing as strategy. So as a CEO, as a coach, as a consultant, your healing is as important as the work you do. The more solid and integrated you are, the more powerful your work, the more solid your coaching. So just imagine if we approached healing as a strategic imperative in organizations. Not just giving people, sick leave or I appreciate the wellness days. What would it mean to say, I'm gonna fund a retreat for you. I'm gonna support healing-centered work, and whatever that means to you. Think about the ways that could kind of impact. So healing as strategy. And then in closing, this obsession that I have now with capacity building. Building our capacity. Because in this moment, it just feels like we're being pushed and forced to hold more. I don't know about you, but I feel more tired than ever before. I feel like I'm working harder than ever before. My nervous system is like those cat memes that are frazzled, I have to practice a lot. So how do we build our capacity to hold more? And what I'm kind of understanding is that it's not really about holding more. In fact, holding more just makes you more exhausted. But it's about alchemizing better. It's about alchemizing better. How do you alchemize better? Well, I think we have to set better boundaries with what is for us and what's not for us, what we're responsible for doing, what we're not responsible for doing. In our homes, in our businesses, in our communities, like what's mine for me to hold here? And being true to that. And being able to communicate that. Oh, no, I'm not, no, that's beyond my scope. I'm sorry. Or no, I'm sorry. I can't do that. Because part of what I'm noticing, all this stuff is happening in society, and many of us are still chronic empaths. I am a recovering people pleaser. So we cannot build capacity if we're overstretching our empathic capacities. So I've been fascinating with this idea of becoming a protected empath. Protected empath, right? What does it mean to be there, to support our clients, to support our people, our partners, yet having like a really solid layer and boundary around how we do that empathic work. This really sacred knowing of like, okay, this is not mine. This is not mine. And having a really powerful way to hold the relationship in a way that honors those boundaries. So becoming a protected empath. In that, co-regulation. Developing more sophisticated ways to co-regulate with the other. Co-regulate in community. So become protected empathy, co-regulation, and the last kind of principle within capacity building that I'm thinking a lot about is personal sovereignty. Right? Like, just imagine a terrain around you and being so anchored in knowing what your personal sovereignty is, what that feels like, your agency. So anytime there's a crossing of that boundary, oh, no, we're not doing that here. We're not doing that here. And I think sovereignty is a really important and good word to use because of its history, especially with our indigenous communities. So what does it mean to uphold your personal sovereignty, to engage in protected empathy, and to co-regulate? Oh, that sounds like a juicy practice. So that's kind of where I'm kind of at right now in terms of capacity building. And remember I said that there was a beautiful contribution in the trauma studies around persistent traumatic environments, right? I'll close by saying that my commitment right now is building capacity through healing-centered learning environments. And what Amy and the team have built here is a healing-centered learning environment, a profound one. So Amy, thank you and the team for bringing us all together. And I close by the answer. The future of healing-centered work is you. It really is you. So you're part of this profound legacy and lineage, and thank you so much for having me. Such a pleasure. Yeah. Thank you so much. That means a lot. And I just had a little bit of notes. That came from the love I have for the field and the love I have for Amy. And in the love that I've been holding you all for a couple weeks. I've been thinking about you, like, okay, so these people are coming. And yesterday and today, I just heard the chatter in the room. I saw the agenda, and that was what was meant to come up. and I did that on purpose so that I can sense into the quality of the work that I'm doing, because at the end of the day, presence. That is what is going to change our clients. That is what is going to change our communities. I'm going to head back to my son, my 4-year-old dragon. Send me energy. All right, take care.